So welcome everybody to this afternoon in celebration of our much loved and missed friend, colleague, family member, tutor, inspiration, Amélie Kuhrt, who was taken from us far too soon and far too suddenly earlier this year. We have people here who have literally known Amélie all their lives, close family members. We have people who studied with her many decades ago or more recently. We have people who were Amélie's colleagues for many decades. And we have people who were just inspired by her work. We have people who have literally crossed the road to be here. We have people who have travelled across continents to be here. And you're all extremely welcome. So this is going to be quite an informal thing. I've lined up some people to come and talk to us about how they remember Amélie and how Amélie has inspired their academic work, but also, I think really importantly, just the way Amélie was, she inspired us to be more than sort of think, but how we are in the world and how we are with other people. So I don't know how long it's going to take. We've booked the place for 2 hours, but there should be, I hope, plenty of space for people. If you feel you want to add to the conversation, we've got mics. We are live streaming, so I'm going to ask people if they're mobile and want to come and stand up and just say a few words as you like. But it's easier for Patrick, who's running the live stream, if you're here in front of the camera. For those of you, if you don't know me, I'm Eleanor Robson. I am both the head of the UCL History department, where Amélie was such a valued and well-loved member of the department for many decades. I am also happened to be her successor but one. I joined UCL 10 years ago, a couple of years after Amélie retired. So I'm going to speak in a couple of capacities, both as the organiser of the event and have been collecting input from people who couldn't attend personally, who wanted to say a few words, but also from my own perspective as a fellow historian of the ancient Middle East, who actually I didn't know Amélie very well personally, but I am very much in the camp of inspired and seriously indebted. So let's start with some student memories. Some of you may have seen, after Amélie passed away, I set up an online memorial message board, which our alumni used to record memories. But a more recent one that came in just a few days ago, I thought was really inspiring. This is by Oliver Peachy, who still works at UCL in administrative capacity. He says, "I was so saddened to hear of Amélie's death at the beginning of the year. Amélie made my university experience and inspired me with her work on the ancient Near East. From my second year, where I took her Seleucid Empire and ancient Near East courses, to her Achaemenid Empire course during my master's, that she'd supported and encouraged me in applying to come to UCL in the first place." Okay, so that is the sort of thing that many of the students said. Then he goes on. "Amélie was my dissertation supervisor at undergrad and for my master's, and I still miss meetings with her in her office upstairs in the department, the big table for our seminars with her folders and books surrounding us on the shelves, the view out of the window, the way she encouraged and moulded my thoughts, and how knowledgeable and open she was." And I think many of us here will recognise that description of the room and Amélie's ways of drawing out the best of us. More than that, though, Oliver says, "I met my wife Rebecca on her courses, who I'd say was even more inspired by Amélie. She was always reading more than me and encouraging me to visit museum exhibitions and attend talks with her at home and abroad. We proudly have well-read copies of Amélie's works on our bookshelves at home, and she will always be remembered by us both with so much fondness and gratitude for the way she inspired us both." So many comments from students like that, both for over the 4 decades or so that Amélie was teaching at UCL. Now, Amélie was an inspiring teacher, not just for those who are in the classroom, but for those who are setting out to teach as well. So I began my teaching career in 1995, and of those of you who know Amélie's career will know that it was a key moment. These two lovely books, The Ancient Near East, 3000 to 300 BC, Volume 1, so Bronze Age, Volume 2, the Iron Age, were absolutely indispensable for me as a junior lecturer. I never met her. She was just the absolute font of all knowledge. I mean, this was too much. This was too much to teach with. I mean, it was terrifying, the amount of information in here. And I was nominally teaching a course that covered this amount, all of this, except for Egypt. But I used to sort of, to begin with, I used to dip in and think, blimey, how on earth did she manage to read all of that, learn all of that, summarize it so effectively? One of the joys about this book is it isn't just a narrative, that it's full, those of you who know the book will know, and if you're too far away, I will circulate it, little pictures, but also little snippets of text, which are invaluable for helping students make things more digestible, maps, timelines. I mean, it was just an incredibly all-in-one beginner's cheat guide to teaching what we now would then call the ancient Near East, and many of us now call the ancient Middle East. So if it were even only for that, I would be in Amélie's debt forever. That book just saved my bacon for many, many years. She was also, through her teaching, I think, a creator of resources that were both teaching resources and research resources. So my last big book project was coincided with another. She liked a small volume, didn't she? Blimey, you could kill somebody with this. So the Persian Empire, a corpus of sources from the Achaemenid period, which I think grew out of her special subject here, where we teach students from collections of primary sources. But Amélie, being Amélie, wasn't content just to provide collections of raw material for 10 students at a time. No, she wanted the whole world to have access to this. And this copy came to me. I was on sabbatical in Heidelberg, and it hadn't reached, although, I mean, it was 5 years after the book was published, that shockingly, it was not in the library at the University of Heidelberg. Can you believe it? So I got it posted to me at great expense. So this book has traveled continents with me, and was again a really useful way into source material that I didn't know very well, and was just incredibly inspiring. So when I arrived at UCL, I wasn't her direct successor, but her successor but one. There was somebody else in the post, Carolina Wartzagas, for a couple of years. But her courses were still intact. And again, I was presented with this rather daunting and yet inspiring, the whole of the Middle East, from Iran to Egypt to Turkey, over just 3,000 years to teach. So again, her source book and her textbooks became particularly helpful. But I also realised that the MA that I'd inherited from her, called Continuity and Change in the Ancient Near East, must have come out or had a relationship with one of the Achaemenid History series that she edited. This is volume 8, Continuity and Change, and the module was indeed called Continuity and Change in the Ancient Near East. So again, she's been with me for, since 1995, the best part of 3 decades, really, challenging me from afar through her writing, through her generosity, to be a broader teacher, to be a better teacher, to be a deep-thinking teacher, as well as providing incredible material for research. Now, I mentioned that there were people that have come from far and near, but there are also many people who couldn't get here today. And I've got some comments from a couple of them who are carrying on Amélie's work. But before I talk about them, I just also want to say hello and thank you, and pass on best wishes from Christopher Tuplin, Bernhard Rieger, Tim Cornell, Wouter Henkelmann and Jean-Jacques Lasner, all of whom wished they could be here today, but for various combinations of logistical and family reasons couldn't be. Now, two other people that can't be here but are very much in carrying on Amélie's legacy. There we are. Karen Radner, who was appointed to a new post alongside Amélie in History of the Ancient Near East here at UCL, when that would have been about 2007, 2008. And was still here when I came in, and Karen is a very close friend and colleague of mine. Not long after I arrived, she was headhunted for an incredible professorship at the University of Munich, where she's gone on to do amazing things at a vast Amélie-like rate. And one of the things that she has been involved with is a new multi-volume history of the ancient Near East, published by OUP. Volume 5, Persia, is coming out this month. Karen can't be here, but she did want to share with you all the fact that they were able to catch the book in proof and add a final paragraph of the preface honouring Amélie's memory and describing how inspirational her work had been for the discipline. I'll read it out for you, for those of you who might not be able to see very well. During the final stages of proofreading of this book, Amélie died on January the 3rd, 2023, aged 78. The doyen of modern research on the Persian Empire and a pioneer in the comprehensive study of the ancient world from the Mediterranean to Central Asia. Her work is referenced in almost all chapters of this book. So the 5 volumes cover the geographical and temporal scope of Amélie's 2. That gives you some sense, right? Amélie can do it in one person, 2 books. It requires a whole team and multiple volumes for the rest of us. As an analysis offered by a single scholar with an encyclopedic knowledge, a clear vision, and a distinct voice, her work remains unsurpassed. She's a brilliant, generous, and inspirational scholar and human being. Amélie is greatly missed. So Amélie's legacy lives on in new works, but it also lives on in other forms as well. You may or may not know that these marvellous twins are going to make a reappearance very soon. And they are being edited by my colleague Eva von Dassau at the University of Washington. And this is an email that she wrote to me a little while ago, and which I'm sharing with your permission. As you all know, I was selected and foolishly agreed to write the 2nd edition of Amélie's The Ancient Near East, a daunting task that I'm working on much more slowly than the publishers would like. So I feel I ought to contribute somehow to today, though I'm tardy even in saying so. I never met Amélie's daughters, nor am I acquainted with almost anyone else in her circle, but she did write the encomium that this is Jack Sasson circulates an email list for ancient Middle Eastern historians and archaeologists. She says, I've written a fine new introduction to ancient Near East too, and she is drafting the first and hardest chapter right now in Berlin, and the work will be dedicated to Amélie's memory whenever it's done. Silence wouldn't be right, so I thought I'd send a note, late and insufficient as it is. Amélie remains amongst us a paragon of scholarship. So, I've been talking in very much in the ways that Amélie's academic work has inspired, but she was also, as we'll hear, and you all know so well, just such a warm and generous person. And when I was first appointed here, she welcomed me with open arms, and again, possibly slightly intimidatingly, very well-meaning, invited me to give a seminar in the Institute of Classical Studies Ancient History series, which I had never done, and I was then in a History and Philosophy of Science department and not used to go out of the loop of talking to ancient historians, but it was done with such warmth and kindness, and it was a lovely way that she set up for me to introduce myself to the discipline in London. I do remain incredibly grateful for that really generous moment of hospitality. But I said lots of you here knew Amélie, live with Amélie in your hearts much more intimately than me. So I am going to now ask Lindsay Allen of King's to come and say a few words and get us thinking from a very different perspective than mine.
I've been thinking about many of the tributes that were paid during Amélie's funeral, and as well as hearing these points today. And it's made me reflect, I think, and sort of think about, in retrospect, the things that I'm able to recognise now about Amélie's contribution as a teacher and a researcher that maybe I wasn't aware of when I started out. And when I started out was kind of in the middle, really, of her UCL career, maybe, in the sense that it was around 1997 when I rocked up and said, I want to do an MA and a PhD. And she was like, but what in? And I sort of wrote her several emails about thinking about the material encounters between the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. And then she would write back, but what exactly? And that is a really good, that's a really good illustration of exactly how she put you immediately on a proper footing, as opposed to any sort of airy-fairy, exploratory, no directional research. And I just wanted to reflect back on now, I guess, well over 20 years of thinking about her practice then as a teacher as it pertains to how the field is now. And this builds on many of Eleanor's points. And I think the first one is the degree to which Amélie was a pioneer, exploring disciplinary grey zones and being brave enough to go into areas of interaction between disciplines that maybe people who inhabited the centre of their discipline did not do. And that can lay you open to criticism, and people say, well, that's not right, or this isn't, but it's brave, and it brings creative and innovative research out. And I think, looking back on it, that's even braver now, even though what she created as a result is a sort of scaffolding, a sort of outline within which so many more people work. And kind of building on that, I think there are two other things, which are that everything she did was not about her being the figure in a field of research. It was about being a participant and part of a community. And again, retrospectively, I realized that's incredibly special. Everything she did was scrupulously referenced. Everything was about acknowledging other people's labor. And she never took anybody else's work for granted. She always gave credit, even if she was disagreeing. And I never heard her really say anything unfair about, even if she was like, well, I'm not sure about that. But she's like, well, but think of it this way, and maybe deal with it. And as a result, she was a great supervisor, because you didn't have to take her line. You could sort of put something in front of her that was weird or odd, and she would sort of take it and say, okay, well, I see this is a contribution, or this is a contribution, or maybe that needs another look. So all of those things were immensely, immensely valuable. And the Persian Empire book, I remember when she was putting that together, again, that's an incredibly selfless piece of work, because even though she could put a narrative forward and could be a voice of this historical period, in fact, what she constructed was an incredibly elaborate kind of peak independent travel era Lonely Planet guide. And those of you who did used to take the kind of whopping paperback with you where you went anywhere and you didn't have any internet or anything, you know what I'm talking about, that you needed this kind of wodge, this ream of papers in order to survive in some new and unknown place. And that is effectively what this has provided, which is a gateway, like so much of things in the academic, in the Achaemenid world. It's a gateway to other cultures, and it's a gateway for other people to write their own travelogues. So you find so many now independent travelogues, many of whom disagree with Amélie, but they're all using that scaffolding. And that's, I think, something we should not forget and cannot forget. And finally, I think the one thing I wanted to say is, which may feel counterintuitive compared to all of this, but was very integral to Amélie's approach, is her sense of enchantment in all of this material and in life and narrative and sources. It made me think of a wonderful moment in the 2-volume Ancient Near East book where she includes a story about Pharaoh getting drunk and having a hangover. And it's Amélie who wanted to put in a story about a Pharaoh getting drunk and having a hangover. So she had a strong sense of narrative rhythm and brilliant kind of charisma and rhetoric to kind of complement it when she actually sort of gave a paper. And in that sense, that sense of enchantment is what I also carried with me, and that she kind of allowed scholars to keep that with you. It wasn't about purging enchantment or purging sort of absurdity. It was like about keeping everything side by side and using it to inform your research and using it to inform that space between teaching and research, which she inhabited throughout her career incredibly successfully. And this, for that reason, when she had her retirement due, I in fact gave a really weird paper in that event, which was about E. Nesbit, rather than about accumulated history or about Amélie herself, but which she was very generously interested in, partly because I wanted to write about a creator and a sort of, a past revolutionary. She quite often inhabited that literary space, which I valued hugely as well, my parents being of roughly the same generation, of that sort of early 1900s, teens, interwar literary production. And so for that reason, I want to finish with a quote not from Nesbit, actually, although I should have chosen Nesbit too, of a book that she cited, I think, in one of either Samarkand Sardis or, yes, one of those two, which is from W.W. Tarn. It was the wonderful kind of folkloric novel that Tarn wrote about being a retired hermit scholar on a Scottish island. And she extracted that passage and used it as a sort of inspirational header for the process of research. So I just want to read that out. This is a mysterious hawker of magical items talking to an unnamed senior scholar who is kind of a stand-in for Tarn himself in his retreat. He's saying, "You are a scholar, and I can do nothing for scholars. You need no ideal, for you have one. You need no dreams, for your life is one. For you, the earth pours out hidden treasure, and the impossible comes true day by day." Thanks very much.
So in a late but very, very welcome addition to the programme, I'm going to ask Tessa to come up and say a few words about being a student with Amélie. So we're going to reverse chronology for a little bit.
I'm afraid I'm not going to be at all as eloquent as what we've just heard, which was lovely. But I'm delighted to share a few just sort of everyday memories. I was so sorry not to be able to be at the funeral, so it's wonderful to do this here. And thank you, Eleanor and Tanya and Natasha and everybody. So Amélie and I were postgraduates together in the very, very early 70s, around essentially this place, which is why it's so great to be here, especially around floor 6, where we would hang out and debate or have our brains picked by the late Keith Hopkins, and try to figure out what Arnaldo Momigliano was actually saying as he spluttered through his cake and his tea. And they were great days. And so we were both sort of hanging around the classic scene, but I think we felt bound, there was a bond because we were both working around the periphery. I mean, I was ostensibly a Roman historian, but frantically learning everything I needed to know to write about Josephus, i.e. Jewish history, languages. And she, I think, if I'm not mistaken, started from the Hellenistic Babylonia end of things, but I could be wrong. And I think we both felt that there was something about being women and breaking boundaries. We were not, neither of us were at all aware of what jobs we would be pursuing or what opportunities there might be. It was also, I think, a rather less, what should one say, well, people now are perforce a little bit more practical and instrumental than we ever were. We floated around and we felt we were being extremely creative, learning and discovering. Neither of us could stand the stuffiness. I'm moving house at the moment and therefore reading before throwing away a great many old papers and off-prints, and I can't believe how pompously everybody, including us sometimes, wrote at that time. It was still quite stuffy, and we didn't care for any of that, though of course we didn't know that we were partly buying into it. Supervision then was a random affair, you know, nothing special was expected of supervisors by their institutions, and as students you got what you got. And Amélie actually suffered under a rather limiting, unhelpful and discouraging form of supervision, not intentional, I'm sure, but it wasn't easy, and I was pleased to be able to lend support and also to come with authority, because I was lucky enough to have the to work from the beginning with Fergus Miller, then in Oxford at Queen's, and who later was to be such a key figure in Amélie's career and life and affections. We didn't know that then, of course. And Fergus had the wonderful gift of seeming to do nothing, but somehow guiding you completely invisibly. And looking back, just about all his research students ended up in the place they wanted to be, doing incredibly different things. So one felt totally independent, and one did get on with it. The model of the, the Scottish Puritan industriousness was there, and so I was able to say to Amélie, look, honestly, take no notice, just do what you want, it'll be all right. She, meanwhile, put me straight about German pronunciation. That was scary. I was always getting things as I thought right, but they were not quite right. And that went on. In later years, we were sort of not close colleagues. We were doing very different things, but in touch academically, and both together at a conference run by Josef Wieserhofer in Kiel, I think it must have been. And there she introduced me to Bienenstücke and other things that we used to go, we slip out to the bakery to get, and I had to say it all absolutely correctly. But in those early years, the other important thing to say is that to be a friend of Amélie's was immediately to be part of the wonderful household in Stroud Green, and little Tanya and Natasha, how well I remember them, older than our children who came along not until 75. I think that you were already well there. And the enormous buzz of creativity and that completely inimitable combination of academic work and cooking and just life and being human beings. And that, and Harry, my husband, was also part of all that, involved in a Rudolf Steiner school, which perhaps we won't go into. But they were just great years, and the bond remained pretty strong. I'm only sad that in those tricky years before lockdown, I did visit and I'd got to know Patrick. We had some evenings together, but not enough. And then came COVID and this incredible shock of Amélie's disappearance. But it's been lovely to reconnect with Natasha and Tanya, another bond, because Natasha's son is being taught at Sussex by my daughter, so it's all rather nice. And that melding of family life and obviously the highest of academic endeavours is, I think, what above all I think of when I think of Amélie.
David, are you ready to be next? If any of this is provoking memories or reminiscences that you would like to share with us, there will be opportunities afterwards.
So this 100 square yards around here have been a very great place for ancient historians. And one of them, Arnaldo Momigliano, who's just mentioned, once said that all his history was autobiography. And an Italian Jew, he said, wasn't to me, but authentic. And I think there are some historians where you can say that their personal life and their research really do make a piece. I'm not sure that's true of Amélie, but let me just briefly sketch in her beginnings and then reflect on that and reflect on her as a historian, because I think that, you know, in this place still under the influence of Momigliano, what perhaps I want to do is to try and think of her as a historian in context, how she came to do the kind of work she did, and a little bit about her legacy, but not much about that, because Eleanor has said that so well. So Amélie was born just before the end of the Second World War in Germany, and she was brought up in her early years in Germany by her grandmother, and I believe she was happy in those years. But when she was still quite young, I'm not exactly sure well, but there are people who would tell me, she was brought over to England, and I think her father was adopted. No, I don't know. Anyway, yeah. She was adopted by, yeah. And so in fact, her first formative years were in Germany, but then she came to England, and somehow found her way to ancient history. And somebody afterwards can fill me in about this, but I'm a little bit vague about quite why she chose to study ancient history. And I saw in her Who's Who entry that she was both at King's and SOAS and at UCL. Clearly an influence must have been Peggy Drower, who died not that long ago at the age of 101 and was the ancient historian. From what you've just said, I don't know, was Peggy Drower her supervisor?
No, not the person, God forbid.
No, I was going to say, because that didn't sound like her. And you can see already very, very deep UCL roots here, because Norman Baines, one of the first of the astonishing series of ancient historians that have been at UCL, had established this course in the ancient Near East. And it was he who put Peggy Drower in place. And she herself, she became a reader and was, very highly respected, but didn't publish a huge amount. But she created the courses that Amélie went on to teach. So I think that's part of the intellectual genesis there. And then there are those years in the 70s. I didn't know her then. Actually, I came to UCL before Amélie, though she's about 10 years older than me. And am I right in thinking she never completed her doctorate? Is that correct? Yeah. And she was working at Chatham House. And then Fergus Miller recognized her talent. And Fergus Miller, of course, another of this extraordinary series of ancient historians at UCL. I won't mention the current ones, but Norman Baines, Arnaldo Mamigliano, Fergus Miller were in the background already. Fergus Miller somehow recognized her talent. He was very well aware of this. It was, he made it clear that he had sort of raised her from the dust. But he had. I mean, I think, astonishing credit to him that he saw the potential there, the extraordinary potential there. And so then Amélie turned up in UCL, and from the point of view of most of the department, she was a rather marginal figure. So let me explain how that could be. UCL was very unusual in that it did put ancient history with history rather than with classics. Hardly anywhere does that. And therefore, the sort of what you might call the Greek and Roman ancient historians, they were indeed, very much part of all of us. And we worked closely, we taught the same students above all. But this degree in ancient and Near Eastern history, their students did not take any other history courses. I'm not saying it was impossible, probably a determined student could always have done it, but in general, they were a separate set of students. I can remember some of them, like Nicholas Beaconsfield there, as being a sort of convivial figure around the place. And Lorna Oakes, whom is here, whom John North and I admitted in what she describes as a horrible interview. That's not how I remember it. But by and large, their teaching was set aside. So the ancient historians worked with them, but the rest of us, medievalists, early modernists, it was like a little fief. And Amélie was a kind of, a light figure, but she seemed, a bit, as I say, a bit marginal. I can remember when some grandee inspector came in, and there was this hilarious exchange when he asked, what do you work on, young woman? And she said, Assyrian history. And he said, oh, what is Syrian history? And there was this long disconnect in which neither was understanding with each other. And I remember there was another colleague, sadly long deceased, David Tierney, who at departmental meetings would always say, who is that woman? And she seemed, you could tell she was really liked by her students. She was, you could tell she was respected, but nobody at that time thought of her as a high flyer. And this, and I think her career is actually quite instructive about history as an academic discipline, and maybe perhaps about some of the differences between federal degrees, such as we had then, but not her degree, and they still have at Oxford and Cambridge, and the more normal kind of model such as we have now, where people can shape their own courses. In those days, we were locked into a federal degree, which in many ways was a fine thing. You learned a culture, but it did mean you couldn't put on a course relating to your research interests except in a very specific field. But Amélie, basically, she was in complete control of her courses. She was, she determined, the content and everything like that. And anyway, she worked quietly away, and this is where academic life is so different, say, from the higher civil service. In the higher civil service, people write reports in which they say, at some point, unable to rise higher, or unlikely to rise higher, or, could make it to deputy secretary or whatever. And had academic life been anything like that, people would have, written to Amélie, obviously extremely worthy, very good teacher, respectable publications, but not going to be one of the greats. And then came these extraordinary books over there, the history of the ancient Near East. From the point of view, of those who weren't in the field and hadn't been to seminars with her, out of the blue, really. As I say, there was a very, she would have been fine if there had been a ref in those days, she would have been fine before that. But these books were completely something else. And the reason that they were so great was that they came out of her teaching. So for her, there was no difference between teaching and research. And this is of course, where being in control of your courses really beats any kind of federal degree. Because if you're in a federal degree, however innovative you might want to be, you're a slave of the curriculum. If you try to teach unusual things, they won't come up in the examination. If you happen to be an examiner, then nobody will do the questions you set, except perhaps your own students, which is unfair. So you're a prisoner. And this is why, I apologize for everything here, why so many Oxford dons or Cambridge dons, especially in the second half of their career, begin to get rather tired and think that they need to have more leave in order to do more research, etc. But in the case of Amélie, what she was doing all this time, this was all in gestation through her teaching. And because she was lucky enough to be in an age where students didn't have languages, and in any case, nobody had the languages needed for this, she was translating them and making them available for students. And then these books, what's so extraordinary about them? First of all, just the technical skills they require. I mean, the languages they require. Old Persian, Elamite, goodness, who knows Elamite? Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, of course, Latin and Greek, and then in addition, all the modern scholarly languages. Of course, French, German, Italian, and ability to read the other Romance languages. I don't know if she read Russian or things like that, wouldn't surprise me. But a maze of languages that, I expect, a decent medievalist can be expected to be comfortable in 5 languages, but this is something else altogether. But then when people know lots and lots of languages, they're often not able to say anything intelligent in any one of them. But the great thing about this book is that it really synthesizes. And what does it synthesize? It's not just the different languages, but all these fragmentary bits of evidence, just, within dozens of yards of us, there is this huge body of evidence of all these clay tablets, some of them as yet unbaked, in the British Library. I mean, I have to say to my classicist friends, you have a tiny, tiny corpus of sources. A diligent student can read the whole classical corpus by the time that he or she is 30, probably. And then, of course, it grows bigger and bigger, so that it's already unmanageable by the later Middle Ages. But then if you go backwards, it's like an hourglass. It gets bigger and bigger again until you have this enormous, unmanageable set of sources. And and of course, there's a great body of scholarship on it, but it is very, very fragmentary. Articles in journals, very specialist monographs, etc. And what she does in that book is she takes all these different sources of such diverse kinds, the odd epic, but all this administrative stuff, astrological stuff, and she puts it together in a synthesis which gives you both a great narrative sweep and is totally up to date with the kind of historical writing that characterizes that generation in a good way, awareness of anthropological theory. There would be sections on pollution, sections on royal wives, etc. So like full 360-degree social and cultural history. And she did all of this. And this was what was bubbling away. I think, was she 51 when it came out? Something like that? Not sure. She was born in 44, came out in 95, I think. So, yeah. So, that is the time when many a scholar says, as a Christchurch don once said when he'd been given a fellowship because he wasn't producing much research, there's so much coming out, I think I have to lay down my pen in order to absorb it. And then, she brings out these wonderful volumes, which are really the framework for the whole period. And then she does it again with the sources for Persian history. Again, that amazing set of languages. That list I gave you before was from a German review of actually the Persian history. And this is not just a reader. This is a whole interpretation of the history. Thanks to Amélie, we see, the history of classical Greece as a sideshow in the great sweep of ancient history. Pericles and all the rest of it, important in their way, but, the big action is over next door in Persia. So this astonishing achievement, I think, comes out of the fact that she was teaching UCL students, and she was teaching UCL students who didn't come up, already secure in their knowledge of the languages. She had to kind of teach them as a historian. She had to translate the languages for them. And in a way, that was the source of her extraordinary creativity. Now, during all of this time, she was really important in the social life of the department. There was a circle of people more cultured than I was who would go to concerts together, Axel Kerner and Chris Abel and other people. And there was a whole North London crew that knew each other very well socially, and those of us who lived far away in places like Wimbledon didn't really get the chance to share in that. But she was, when you're a London historian, people live so far away from each other that it's hard for there to be a real community. And there has been a community in the history department, and especially she was one of the nodal points around which community could center. Now, at the beginning, I talked about Arnaldo Mobiliano saying that, I'm an Italian Jew, all my history is autobiography. I think, I'm not sure that's really true of Amélie. I think if you're going to, or if it's true, the autobiography is the autobiography of somebody in the history department at UCL. If you think about it, that tradition, Peggy Drower going back to Norman Baines, Fergus Miller recognizing her talent, and then this environment that put the history of the ancient Middle East on the map, and which gave her a free hand to teach what she wanted, and gave her colleagues that recognized her and supported it. In a way, intellectually, the context that explains Amélie, I think, is the great ancient history tradition in UCL.
So before you go, so I have a question. I'm sure some of us, it's really helpful, it's really interesting hearing this early institutional history of Amélie's career. So at what point then did things change so that the ancient Middle East became incorporated into the general curriculum of the department?
Okay. Yes, that would have been That would have been the Great Revolution when the federal degree was abolished. So we had a degree pretty much like the ones at Oxford and Cambridge, in which there was a syllabus. It's a kind of magnificent syllabus in a way, covering the whole of world history from 3000 BC to Mao Zedong, and there were boards of examiners in which everyone took part, and lasting sometimes 2 days, and there were faculty boards which decided, or shaped the syllabus. And that was abolished at some point in the 90s. Now, up until then, she had a kind of White Rose Ranch, which gave her freedom. And after that, in a way, courses in the history department were open to everybody. So she had this enclave within a rather rigid system, but because it was sufficiently small for her to have almost total control of it, it was, as it has been for all of us since then. And certainly, I'm sure for many others here, it was I didn't realize at the time, but a huge liberation when we were able to teach the courses that we wanted, and shape them how we like. And the department has always been extremely understanding about that. But before the abolition of the federal degree, which I defended at the time quite wrongly, you were in a bit of a prison, and it was only because Amélie had her own fiefdom that she was kind of exempt from that. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, thank you. I said I'd circulate the books to jog some memories, and I forgot to. But as David has been and Lindsay have both been finding them so central to reminiscences, I thought it might be nice just to pass them around and jog some memories. I'm also going to ask Axel, another of Amélie's colleagues and friends, to come up and say a few words. Thank you very much, Axel. And Axel has come to us from Berlin, so thank you.
Dear Natasha, dear Tanya, dear family, friends and colleagues, I thought I would speak about Amélie's German origins, that Heather already evoked so nicely, because it's an aspect of her life, of her identity at UCL that maybe some of us didn't know quite as well. But after having shared my thoughts on Amélie with family and friends at the funeral already 6 months ago, it is not easy talking about her again without repeating myself. If I accepted this invitation today, it is not because I have more to say about Amélie than others. Instead, I believe there was something in my relationship to Amélie that I wish to share with you, because it formed part of Amélie's persona, even if it remained inaccessible to some of the people around her, even those with whom she went to bakeries in Kiel and Heidelberg. My own background and upbringing connected with Amélie's origins, dating back to the time before she arrived in England and in Bath as a young girl. It was a shared past of language and culture that separated her from other people she met throughout her life. A past made of memories, of children books, lullabies, and silly verses. Reminiscences of colors, smells, and noises that mattered more to her than we might think if we consider the academic she was and the person who lived most of her life in England. It was a world made of words run out of fashion, Wäscheschrank und Strohsterne, and untranslatable lines from the songs of Schubert and of Schumann's Schöner Müllerin, she so loved. Da halten die Englein die Augen sich zu und schluchzen und singen die Seele zur Ruhe. The little angels who close their eyes because they want to shed the tears away, but it's a bad translation. As Patrick, who unfortunately can't be here, knows, many of the songs we both cherished were less highbrow, as the one about the two rabbits, for instance, the one about the two rabbits who feared they had been shot, but then noticed they were still alive and happily hopped away. She sang this for Elsa when she was little, but probably for Hector too, and for his cousins, I think, too. And Hector was born just around the same time as Elsa, and so we rediscovered these songs of her childhood and my childhood together to sing them to our children. We shared things about Clara Schumann and Fontane, about her grandmother's dollhouse, about countless little objects not many people know about today, even in Germany, like Messerbänkchen, Natasha and Tanya remember, or the little Romanian dictionary she gave me when I started my research in Transylvania a little while ago. Amélie and little things, what anthropologists like her friend Mary Douglas call material culture. There would be enough stuff to write a book about Amélie and the things she loved. Do you remember Amélie's delicate, very special handwriting? In my A to Z, I keep a note she wrote me back in 1996 when she first invited me for supper to Ossian Road, explaining how to walk from Finsbury Park to her house. Back then, I didn't know that one day this house would become my second home. When I had the privilege to move in with Amélie and Patrick after the referendum, we spent long evenings with wine, simple suppers she cooked for us, and we talked about more memories and more little things, books and about music. In their fights over Bach versus Handel, I positioned with Amélie, although Patrick seemed to provoke these situations on purpose because it was what he loved so much about Amélie. With whom could he have these exchanges today? Amélie also was a fine English lady, with her unique style, an elegance she kept even when she got so incredibly sick. But she also remained a little foreign to many, something we both shared. On my first day at UCL, when Nazneen so kindly introduced me to my new colleagues in the departmental office, someone said, "Oh, I thought I had heard a foreign voice." And later that evening, Amélie confirmed that this would probably never change. And probably it didn't, but it became a secret bond between us. Or perhaps not so secret, as it turned out on the day when during a departmental meeting, I think it was when David was head of department, Amélie and I hesitantly suggested that once a year the windows of our offices could be cleaned, and someone just yelled, "You Germans!" the colleague was probably right, because it was one of those years when hundreds of jobs were supposed to be cut at UCL. Et plus ça change. During our over 25 years of companionship, Amélie told me a lot about the workings of British academia, what to say and what to hide, what mattered and what didn't. She understood why an obscure bulletin of some learned society might be a worthier place to publish a paper compared to a posh American press. She hated it when people tried to pull rank. She hated it when people tried to pull rank using the FBA behind their names to impose themselves or to manipulate decisions. What counted for Amélie was always the person, and that was often a marginalized person. In the Houseman room, she smiled at people others tried to avoid. We often sat there eating our homemade sandwiches, which we preferred to the food served at the counter. It was also cheaper, and Amélie didn't like wasting money, always preferring to save a penny or two for Natasha and Tanya. I wish to end my short talk with the poem I read for Amélie at the funeral. It's by Christian Morgenstern, a master of Dada, whom Amélie often quoted from memory. It's in German, and as silly as it could be, but connected to her work and to the work of so many ancient historians here. It's about a parrot remembering Genesis and ancient languages. You can listen to it even if you don't understand Amélie's language. I read it for her. Es war einmal ein Papagei, der war beim Schöpfungsakt dabei und lernte gleich am rechten Ort des ersten Menschen erstes Wort. Des Menschen erstes Wort war A und hieß fast alles, was er sah. Zum Beispiel Fisch, zum Beispiel Brot, zum Beispiel Leben oder Tod. Erst nach Jahrhunderten voll Schnee erfand der Mensch zum A das B und dann das L und dann das Q und schließlich noch das Z hinzu. Gedachter Papagei in dem ward älter als Methusalem. Wir waren treu in Brust und Schnabel die erste menschliche Vokabel. Zum Schlusse starb auch er am Zips, doch heute noch steht ein Bild in Gips, geschmückt mit einem grünen A im Staatsschatz von Ekabata. Ich danke. Thank you.
Axel, that was really lovely. Thank you.
I don't want to give you the little
No,
dictionary.
keep your beautiful little dictionary. But yes. Compare and contrast the tiny dictionary and the huge volumes that Amélie produced. The last bit in our scheduled programme is Nikki, Professor Nicola Miller, another dear friend and colleague of Amélie's. And so thank you, Nikki, very much.
Well, thank you, Eleanor, for organising this. It's a real pleasure to have an opportunity to speak a little bit about 30 years of friendship with Amélie. Amélie was one of very few women in the history department when I joined back in 1990. Unusually at that time, we had a woman head of department, Wendy Davis, distinguished medievalist. Other women were clustered in ancient history. There was Lynn Foxall, who left a few years later, and Riep van Bremen. After the 11th century, though, it was a male world. Amélie did not sweep me up in any feminist embrace. That would not have been her style. But she did take steps to befriend me. And in so doing, she opened my eyes to identifiable and even appealing ways of being an academic historian. In the current terminology of which she would almost certainly not have approved, she became something of a role model. We were both working in fields which, as you've heard, were outliers in a department that was overwhelmingly focused on British and continental European history. The ancient Near East and my specialism, Latin America, were both sort of special areas of which the department was proud, sort of, but a bit wary. And Amélie was delightfully artful in taking advantage of the fact that few of her colleagues knew much about her area. So that meant she could continue teaching her material just as she believed it ought to be taught, whatever the attempts to standardize across the department. The survey course on the ancient Near East remained distinctive for its 2-hour lectures, which Amélie insisted were absolutely necessary to allow students to digest and understand the material. So in this, she showed me the importance of integrity in teaching and of tailoring format to material rather than fitting into any prescribed model. And she always set the highest of intellectual standards for her students in the firm conviction that they would rise to them. She also made me very aware of the distinctive intellectual work of the historian and its value. In a way, it's quite fitting that this event is being held in the Institute of Archaeology, for Amélie had a great respect for archaeology and was deeply knowledgeable about it. But she always emphasized the importance of asking historical questions, of creating a distinct intellectual space for the historical mode of inquiry, and of bringing the history of the ancient Near East into mainstream historical debates and comparative frameworks. This was in many ways her life's work, and I think all of us learned from her. For me, as I was making a transition from an area studies background to a history department, her way of thinking about the past in this comparative and transnational perspective had a lasting influence. Beyond the specifically academic, I was in awe of how deeply steeped Amélie was in general culture, plays, novels, music, poetry. She was what in Spanish America used to be known as culto, that is, not only well-informed by reading, looking, and listening, but also changed as a person as a result. She was as far removed as possible from the consumer attitude that ticks off cultural experiences and then displaces them with the next one. She had almost perfect recall of productions she had seen years ago, especially of Shakespeare, which she read habitually as something she found necessary to her. She could discuss particular scenes in all the 19th century classic novels and many others besides, including the plot intricacies of the detective stories she loved. As you've heard, everyone has tales to tell of Amélie's kindness, thoughtfulness, and gift for friendship. From over 30 years, 2 moments stand out in my mind when she really helped me to cope with difficult times. The first was when I decided to end a long-standing relationship. As soon as Amélie heard this news, she rang and invited me over that very evening, not a safe 2 weeks hence when I might have been expected to have calmed down a bit. At such short notice, I was expecting a share of her own usual simple supper. But she prepared me a 4-course meal with things she knew I especially liked because we cooked for each other quite often. It was just the 2 of us. Patrick must have been at his own house, and we sat there exchanging memories of living with reprobates, by the end of which I'd begun to feel that normal life would be possible again before too long. The second time Amélie particularly stepped in to help in a way that no one else could have done was in 2015 when my husband John had a heart bypass operation. Again, she just rang and insisted I went over. Several times during the 10 days or so he was in hospital. She didn't mind when I came late. She didn't mind when I was too exhausted to have much to say. She just gave me wine and cheese and the occasional cigarette if she felt I needed it. And I always remember her saying she thought of cigarettes as her friends. And it was that very active kind of friendship, which not waiting to be asked for help, but creating a situation when you received it, almost whether you wanted it or not, that made Amélie's friendship so very special. Above all, what I most admired about Amélie was her ability to be herself. You've already heard many tales of this. She really, I think, didn't worry about what other people thought. When I first met her at UCL in the early 1990s, I was an insecure 30-something She was in her late 40s, and she showed me ways of navigating the idiosyncrasies and the occasional pomposities of academic life in an easygoing kind of way. Amélie could occasionally be enjoyably acerbic, but she was always good-humoured and humorous. I remember her being told by a rather pompous waiter that she was not allowed to smoke in UCL's old refectory. She turned to him, bestowed on him her most winning smile. I said, "I know, but you're not going to tell me, are you?" She seemed to be entirely unconcerned about whether anyone thought she was cool or not. I was rather amazed one evening, sitting around her table, to hear her tell everybody how much she enjoyed ironing, especially on a Saturday evening, listening to Radio 4. I mean, I don't actually mind ironing very much either, but I'd have gone to some lengths to avoid admitting it. Of course, Amélie could do that because she was utterly stylish, precisely because of her wit and aplomb. As a historian, but most of all as a person, she was a lasting inspiration to me. And we never did agree about Virginia Woolf, but moments of her being are lodged in my life.
So that is the last of the prepared talks, and all of them very moving, and I think by pure happenstance rather than me coordinating anything, have produced a really rounded picture of Amélie's life, work, influence, humanity. But there are lots of people here who I know knew Amélie in a different way and might have their own reminiscences, so we've got plenty of time. So if anyone wants to come up and just say a couple of things about her, that would be really lovely if you wanted. Yes, please.
For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Morcott, and I think I'm probably in the first students that Amélie taught here. I belong to that period from 1977 to 1980, when Peggy Drower was retiring and Amélie was taking over. And at that particular point, I had tutorials with Peggy in the first year, and then in the second year, I had them with Amélie. And they were two very contrasting people. Amélie terrified me. And she occupied a small office next to the lift, I think on the first or second floor here at that particular point. It was before she had her full appointment. And about 3 or 4 first years would gather in there, and Amélie would sit on the filing cabinet, rolling her cigarettes and asking us questions. At that point, I was very thin and rather an effete youth. And Peggy, I've been able to sort of get round very easily. I found very nice and easy to get on with. Amélie terrified me, but we carried on long after I'd finished my degree, and I used to give lectures on the Near Eastern course for her, until I was, in fact, in the end, her teaching assistant as late as 1993. So I had a long connection with her in that context. And one thing that has been mentioned is her relationship with Peggy. And Amélie and Peggy were very great friends. Amélie revered Peggy. And Peggy was, as David Davray said, not a great publisher. She wrote for the Cambridge Ancient History. She didn't do a lot of research, but she was absolutely on top of her teaching. She knew everything. She'd been reading everything for decades. And she'd started out as a student with Flinders Petrie. And then after the war, she'd been asked to take up this teaching of Near Eastern history, as it was then. And I think in many ways it still should be Near Eastern, but that's another issue. And she developed that course, and she developed the modules. And Amélie told me that when she was at King's as a classicist, for some reason she had to do a course with Peggy, and she thought it was going to be terribly boring. And then Peggy started talking about, one of the kings of Babylon, Nabonidus, I think it was, who went off to Tamar in the Arabian desert for years, and this intrigued her. And she gradually turned from classics to Near Eastern because of that and because of Peggy. And Peggy certainly saw in Amélie a really great talent. And so eventually it was obvious that she was going to take over from Peggy. And at that particular time in the late 70s, UCL Ancient History Department was Fergus Miller, who'd just come in, replacing Momigliano. Tim Cornell just started up, and then John North, who I see here, was teaching Roman Republic and other things as well. And then there was the Egyptology department. And David Davray talked about this federal degree in which we were sort of boxed. I was History Branch 1A. And History Branch 1A was Greek, Roman, Near Eastern, specializing in Egyptian in the Egyptology department, another world in many ways. And there was no flexibility. And at the time, I found this terribly constraining. Now, having taught in the university for a long time myself, in what I can only describe as pick and mix degrees that mean nothing in archaeology, I actually have come to appreciate being channeled in that way. And the one little bit of rebellion I had was in the third year when I'm sorry to say I didn't want to do the Roman Republic yet again. And I went to James Burns and did History of Political Ideas. And I didn't even do the ancient stuff. I did Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Locke, but that's a different thing. But that was the only sort of little bit of flexibility. And so I did the Egyptian language and Egyptian stuff over in the Egyptology department. But the core of it was this ancient history, Greek, Roman, and then the two sets of Near Eastern. And the important thing that came out of that is context. And what Peggy was good at and what Amélie was good at was context. Egyptologists are very bad at context. They focus on Egypt and nothing else in the world exists to them. I'm not even really Egypt-based. My base is in northern Sudan, in Nubia, and that was what I really wanted to do. So I'm sort of slightly odd in that way as well. It wasn't just mainstream Egypt. Years later, when Amélie was working on the Achaemenid History series, she rang me up one day, and it was the volume, I think volume 5, Achaemenid Persia and Old Empires. And she said to me, "We haven't got anything on Achaemenid Persia and Nubia." And most people will think, well, that's not surprising. It's a very weird question to ask somebody. And she said, "Will you write a chapter?" And I said, "Yeah, fine." And so I sat down and did it, because in fact there is a lot to say there. But I think it would not be usual for somebody's mind to go immediately to this issue of Achaemenid Persia and Nubia and then think, oh, well, I know who I want to do that. And with my own work, although I'm down there in Africa, in the periphery, very periphery of the Near East, I'm always constantly looking back, and my mind works around to that context. And that context is very important. And I've had my own postgraduate students as well. And one of those was actually working just in a temporary contract on this new exhibition at the British Museum, Luxury and Power. And I think that exhibition, when I went round it, it in many ways shows how now, decades afterwards, what Amélie was doing in all those volumes with Sucho in White and others actually has changed the perception of Achaemenid Persia. And it has, in many ways, diminished that sort of great emphasis on Greece as the great thing. In a rather weird sort of incident that doesn't really matter very much, I was asked to write the Penguin Historical Atlas of Ancient Greece. We'll just gloss over the reasons for that, as you do ask a Nubianist to do this. And when I looked at what the thing had been drafted out, and I said, well, you can't do this anymore. it ended with Alexander, one map of Alexander the Great. And I said, you can't do that. You need a whole Hellenistic section. And so we rejigged the whole thing, and we had this whole section on the Hellenistic world. And then when you look back at the Persian Wars, there is a huge amount that I put in on the Near East. And it was really only afterwards I looked at it and I thought, this is where I've come from. This is my training. Greece, just a relatively small series of city-states. And then we have the Near East with its long history and this huge influence. And some people think that it's not a history of ancient Penguin Atlas of ancient Greece at all, that it is in fact just the Near East with a bit of Greece tagged on at the end. They may be right. One of my colleagues at the British Museum once, in the middle of a conference actually, said, I thought you always considered yourself to be an Egyptologist. The response to that is, no, I consider myself to be an historian, and that's because of the background and the training that I had here with Amélie and with Peggy and with John North and Fergus Miller and the history department. And the one thing that Egyptology is very bad at is history. History is something that people who are not philologists or not archaeologists do. It's sort of just tacking stuff together. And what David said about Amélie looking for historical questions, that's what I've spent my time doing, and trying to find some answers to those questions. I read a book not long ago by one of my esteemed and highly valued colleagues, as we say, and at the end of it, I threw it on one side and said, there's nothing in this that resembles anything that we might think of as history, of historical ideas, what is going on. It's just a series of lists. And that's the difference between just putting things together and then having these historical questions, the things that we were trained to do by Peggy and by Amélie particularly. So that's all I've got to say. Thank you. I should also say Amélie corrected my German too, as did Peggy Drower. Thank you.
Any other offers of reminiscences or thanks? Yes, please. Come up, Natasha. That would be lovely.
Thank you just so much again to Eleanor and to others for organising this event here today. I did come here a few months ago to listen to Bert van der Speck talking about his work, but also talking about our mother and her work. You know, this place, I remember coming here as a child with our mum in, you know, in the school holidays. We used to just hang out with her doing our drawing and, you know, just all this kind of stuff would wash over us like Achaemenids and Hittites and, you know, we just think, oh, she's going on about that again, you know. Obviously, when you're 5 years old, it doesn't really mean very much to you. But, you know, what I do remember is that, you know, for many years she had a series of part-time jobs. And then, you know, when our parents separated, you know, she was a single mother and it was quite tough. You know, so she had the Chatham House job and then she used to give gallery talks in the British Museum and, you know, and this kind of thing. So it was really quite hard. And Tessa mentioned about, you know, the supervisor, the PhD supervisor who will remain nameless, I mean, that was really the reason, I think, why she gave up on the doctorate. Obviously, she was eminently capable of completing it in different circumstances. And I just also remember the great joy when she got the job in 1979 at UCL. You know, I remember her kind of coming in and saying, I've got a job. And, you know, and we said, but what do you mean you've already got a job? She said, no, I mean a proper job. And that was so important for her as well. You know, she was paying the mortgage and everything on her own just to have that steady income, but also to be able to do exactly, you know, as people have said, you know, to teach what she really loved. And I'll just end by saying that I do remember her coming home one day and saying that there was some graffiti found in the toilets at UCL that said, Amélie Kuhrt is God. So I just finished.
I guess it's difficult to top that, isn't it? Really, I wanted this to be a very sort of social occasion, because I know lots of people here haven't seen each other for a while, and there's lots of catching up to do, and happy memories as well as sadness that Amélie is no longer with us to share. So thank you again for coming. It's been so moving and surprising and confirming. I've learnt things about Amélie that I had never known about. Many of my impressions of her have been confirmed. But it's been such a joyous occasion, really, in amongst the sadness. So thanks again for coming, and thank you very much, Tanya and Natasha and Amélie's family, for being with us. And yeah, a quick thank you for Izzy and Queenie, who helped me organise today. And yeah, see you upstairs, I hope. Thank you. And thank you, folks, for joining online too.